Ida Culver, at 74 years old, had believed that 50 years of marriage to the gentlest man she had ever known, 50 years of pressing his shirts and mending his coat pockets and sitting beside him on the porch swing while the Kansas sunset turned the wheat fields into rivers of copper and gold, had earned her something more than what she received on the morning his will was read. She had given 40 years to a small alteration shop on Main Street, her hands guiding fabric through a Singer sewing machine 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, hemming dresses for prom nights and letting out suits for funerals and patching work trousers for farmers who couldn't afford new ones. She had given 50 years to Lloyd Culver, the last teacher at the Prairie Creek one-room schoolhouse, a man who kept chalk dust on his fingertips and believed that a child's crayon drawing of a horse held as much meaning as any painting in a gallery. Then, 11 months before this story opens, Lloyd's heart had stopped on a Tuesday morning in November while he sat at the kitchen table reading the county historical register he had edited for 3 decades. And before the first spring, meadowlarks returned to the Flint Hills that April, his nephew Curtis had already contacted an attorney about the estate. Ida wasn't just overlooked, she was reduced, as if half a century of devotion could be measured in acreage and found insufficient. While Curtis Culver and his wife Jolene divided Lloyd's 240 acres of productive wheat land and calculated the corporate lease revenue from his farm equipment and grain storage, Ida received the deed to the condemned Prairie Creek one-room schoolhouse on 3 acres of unworkable prairie, a building that had been boarded up since 1971, its white clapboard siding cracked and peeling, its windows broken, its roof sagging, its rusted bell tower listing to the east like a tired old man leaning on a fence post. 3 acres and a shack with a chalkboard, Curtis had said at the reading, leaning back in his chair with the particular satisfaction of a man who has just inherited 240 acres of prime Kansas wheat ground. That's what 50 years of marriage gets you. Aunt Ida, Uncle Lloyd's sentimental junk pile. But what Curtis and Jolene didn't know, what they were too busy counting bushels per acre to imagine, was that beneath the teacher's desk in that condemned schoolhouse, Lloyd Culver had built a sealed compartment containing documents that would strip Curtis of the mineral rights beneath his most productive wheat fields, and a collection of childhood artwork worth more than every combine and grain silo Curtis had inherited combined. Lloyd had been preparing for this moment for decades, hiding his most valuable discoveries in the one place no one with any sense of profit would ever think to look, a condemned schoolhouse that smelled of chalk dust and old paper and the quiet devotion of a man who believed every child's work had value. If you've ever felt the world dismiss you because of your age, if you've been handed what everyone else called worthless and told to be grateful for the leftovers, if you've sat alone in a quiet house after losing the person who understood you best and wondered whether anyone would ever see what you were worth, this story is for you. Subscribe now and hit the bell, because what Ida Culver found when she lifted the leather top of a teacher's desk in a schoolhouse that hadn't held a class in over 50 years will make you believe that love never stops teaching, even after the last bell has rung. Welcome to the last chapter. The will was read in the office of Harold Prewitt, an estate attorney in Cottonwood Falls, Kansas, on a Wednesday morning in early October, 11 months after Lloyd's funeral. The office occupied the second floor of a limestone building on Broadway Street, and the windows looked out over the Flint Hills in every direction. the endless undulation of tall grass prairie that rolled toward the horizon like a green and amber sea, broken only by the dark lines of hedgerows and the occasional white dot of a grain elevator miles away. The room smelled of old carpet and the faint sweetness of pipe tobacco that Harold had quit smoking 15 years earlier, but that still lived in the fabric of his curtains and the leather of his chair. Ida sat on one side of Harold's desk in her long lavender wool cardigan over a white cotton blouse with a lace collar, her charcoal gray wool skirt pressed with the invisible perfection of a woman who had ironed 10,000 garments, her sturdy black leather shoes planted flat on the floor. Her brown leather suitcase with its brass clasps rested beside her chair, Lloyd's pocket watch inside, along with a change of clothes and the Bible Lloyd had kept on his nightstand for 40 years. The silver thimble on its chain hung against the lace of her collar, and her hands, those precise, patient hands that had sewn 10,000 hems and stitched 10,000 seams, lay folded in her lap with a stillness that was not calm but controlled, the way a seamstress holds a needle steady in fabric that wants to pull. Curtis sat across from her, broad-shouldered in his tan Carhartt jacket over a denim shirt, his sunburned face carrying the permanent squint of a man who spent his days measuring wheat yields against weather forecasts. His close-cropped sandy hair was going gray at the temples, and his polished cowboy boots were crossed at the ankles beneath the chair. Jolene sat beside him, her highlighted blonde ponytail tight against her scalp, her fitted charcoal blazer crisp, her leather planner open on her knee, with columns of numbers already written in neat rows, lease rates, equipment depreciation schedules, per-acre projections. She had been calculating the value of Lloyd's estate since the funeral reception, where she had excused herself to make 3 phone calls to agricultural leasing companies before the mourners had finished their second plates of casserole. What Ida didn't realize yet was that Lloyd had arranged every element of what was about to unfold with the same meticulous care he had applied to preserving 50 years of his students' artwork. Not a single piece lost, not a single detail forgotten. Harold Prewitt read the will in a steady, unhurried voice that carried the cadence of a man who had been reading legal documents in this office for 35 years and understood that the words mattered less than the silences between them. The 240 acres of productive farmland, the wheat fields, the pasture ground, the farmhouse, all equipment, grain storage, and the savings account containing $112,000 passed to Curtis Culver. Lloyd had felt the pull of family obligation. Curtis was his brother Gerald's only son, and Gerald had died young. And Lloyd, who had no children of his own, had watched Curtis grow from a boy who used to sit in the back row of the Prairie Creek Schoolhouse into a man who measured everything by what it could produce. And Lloyd had loved him anyway, the way a teacher loves even the students who never quite learn the lesson. Ida received the deed to the Prairie Creek one-room schoolhouse on 3 acres of unimproved prairie land. Lloyd's personal effects, his books, his clothing, his pocket watch, his county historical records, and a savings account containing $4,200. The silence after the read-in lasted 3 full seconds. Ida counted them the way she counted stitches, each one precise, each one holding the seam together. Then Curtis laughed. Not a cruel laugh exactly, but the particular laugh of a man who finds genuine humor in what he considers someone else's misfortune. "Well," he said, slapping both hands on his thighs and pushing back from the desk, 3 acres and a condemned building. That's quite the inheritance, Aunt Ida. You want me to have the county come out and tear it down for you? Save you the trouble of looking at it?" Jolene clicked her pen and made a notation in her planner without looking up. "The 3 acres are zoned agricultural, but the soil quality is poor. Too much limestone subsurface for row crops," she said, as though reading from a report she had already prepared. "You could lease it for grazing if you fenced it, but the cost of fencing 3 acres wouldn't justify the return. Honestly, Ida, the most practical thing would be to sell it to us. We'd give you a fair price. Call it a family courtesy." "How much?" Ida asked. Her voice was even and measured, the voice of a woman who had spent 40 years negotiating fabric prices with suppliers and explaining alterations, costs to customers who wanted everything for nothing. 2,000, Jolene said. "Maybe 2,500. It's 3 acres of scrub prairie with a condemned building on it. Nobody else would offer you that much." "I'll keep it," Ida said. Curtis shrugged. "Suit yourself, but don't come asking me to haul away the rubble when the roof finally caves in." He stood, and Jolene stood with him, her planner snapping shut with the decisive sound of a woman who had already moved on to the next column of numbers. They left without shaking Harold Prewitt's hand, because people like Curtis and Jolene did not shake hands with estate attorneys in small Kansas towns. They shook hands with commodity brokers and lease managers and the kind of people who understood that land was only valuable if it produced something you could sell. Harold Prewitt watched them go. Then he turned to Ida, and something in his expression, a steadiness behind his wire-rimmed glasses, a patience that seemed to carry more weight than the will he had just read, made her pause. "Mrs. Culver," he said, "Lloyd came to see me 6 times over the past 3 years. Each time he brought documents to add to the estate file. He was very specific about what went into the will and what didn't. The schoolhouse deed. He wanted you to have that above everything else. He said you'd understand why when you got there." Ida pressed her thumb against the silver thimble at her chest and felt its familiar weight. The cool metal her mother had worn every day for 40 years. The same thimble Ida had worn every day of her own working life. She nodded at Harold Prewitt and picked up her brown leather suitcase and walked out of the office into the October wind that swept down Broadway Street, carrying the smell of cut wheat and dry grass and the faint mineral edge of the limestone hills that gave this part of Kansas its bones. She spent the next 3 weeks in the farmhouse that was no longer hers. Curtis had given her until the end of October, which he described as generous, and which felt to Ida like being told the exact number of stitches remaining before the thread ran out. She packed Lloyd's belongings into boxes, his history books in one, his teaching files in another, his county records in a third. His reading glasses went into the pocket watch case. His favorite flannel shirt, the green and brown plaid he wore on Saturday mornings. She folded and placed inside her suitcase where she could feel its shape when she carried it. But it was the pocket watch that stopped her. Lloyd's silver pocket watch, the one he had carried every day for 50 years. The one that still kept perfect time because Lloyd had wound it every morning the way he had done everything in his life, with quiet, unfailing regularity. She turned it over in her hands and noticed something she had never seen before. The back plate of the watch case was slightly thicker than it should have been. She pressed the edge with her thumbnail, the precise pressure of a seamstress testing a seam, and the back plate popped open to reveal a second compartment behind the movement. Inside, taped flat against the inner case, was a small brass key. No note, no explanation, just the key, hidden inside the watch Lloyd had carried against his chest for half a century, waiting for the hands that would know what to do with it. She called Rosemary Biddle that evening. Rosemary had been Ida's closest friend for 40 years. They had met at a church potluck in 1984 and had been sharing coffee on each other's porches every Thursday morning since. Rosemary was 76, a retired school bus driver who had driven the Prairie Creek route for 30 years, picking up ranch kids and farm kids and the children of oil field workers on roads so remote that the county didn't bother to plow them in winter. She was stout and ruddy-cheeked, with thick gray hair cut short for practicality, and bright hazel eyes that missed nothing from behind the wheel of whatever vehicle she happened to be driving. "Rosemary," Ida said, "I need you to drive me out to the schoolhouse tomorrow morning." "The Prairie Creek Schoolhouse?" "Ida, that building's been boarded up since Nixon was president. What on earth do you want to go out there for?" "Lloyd left me a key. I found it hidden inside his pocket watch. I think it opens something at the schoolhouse." The line went quiet for a moment. Then Rosemary said, "I'll be there at 7. Wear boots. That prairie grass will be waist-high this time of year." Rosemary's old Ford pickup bounced along the county road that led to the Prairie Creek Schoolhouse, the chassis creaking over ruts and the radio playing a station out of Emporia that neither of them was listening to. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of late October morning that turns the Flint Hills into a landscape of amber and rust, the tall grass bending under a wind that had traveled across 100 miles of open prairie without meeting a single obstacle tall enough to slow it down. The sky was enormous, the particular Kansas sky that makes every building look small and every person look smaller, a sky so wide that the horizon seems to curve at the edges like the rim of a bowl. The schoolhouse appeared in the distance, the way all prairie buildings appear, as a shape rising from the grass, like something the land had produced on its own, an afterthought of the landscape rather than an imposition upon it. As they drew closer, the details sharpened. The white clapboard siding was cracked and gray where the paint had surrendered to 50 Kansas winters. The windows were broken, some boarded with plywood that had itself begun to warp and split. Others open to the weather, their glass edges jagged. The roof ridge sagged in the center like a spine carrying too much weight, and the rusted iron bell tower leaned to the east, its bell still visible through the corroded openings, frozen in a silence that had lasted since the last day of school in May of 1971. A faded wooden sign reading Prairie Creek School hung above the entrance by a single rusted nail, tilted at an angle that suggested it had been hanging that way for decades, held in place by nothing more than habit and the reluctance of old things to let go completely. "Lord," Rosemary said, pulling the truck to a stop in the grass where a gravel path had once been. "I haven't been out here since I retired the bus route in 2002. Used to pick up the Gunderson kids and the Harkins girl right at that step right there." She pointed at the cracked limestone slab that served as the schoolhouse's front step. "Etta Mae Harkins. You remember her? She was one of Lloyd's last students. Quiet little thing, always drawing in the margins of her workbooks. Lloyd used to say she had more talent in her left pinky than most artists had in their whole careers." That name would matter later, but Ida didn't know that yet. She stepped out of the truck with her suitcase in one hand and the brass key from Lloyd's pocket watch in the other. The wind hit her immediately, the endless Kansas wind that smells of dry grass and distance and the faint mineral sharpness of limestone bedrock. and it pressed her lavender cardigan against her thin frame and pushed her white pin curls across her forehead. She walked through the tall grass toward the schoolhouse door, the grass brushing against her charcoal skirt, the silver thimble swinging against her chest with each step, and she felt the particular loneliness of a woman approaching a building that everyone else in the world has dismissed as worthless. The door was not locked. The padlock that had once secured it hung open on a hasp that had rusted into a permanent position, and the door itself, weathered pine planks with a cast-iron handle, swung inward when she pushed it with a sound that was less a creak than a sigh, the exhalation of a room that had been holding its breath for 53 years. What she found inside made her stop in the doorway with her suitcase hanging from one hand and the brass key pressed against her palm in the other. The schoolhouse was not abandoned, it was preserved. The rows of small wooden student desks were arranged exactly as they had been on the last day of school in 1971. 3 rows of 6, each desk with its hinged lid and its inkwell hole and its pencil groove, worn smooth by decades of children's hands. The potbelly cast-iron stove stood in the center of the room with its stovepipe rising to the ceiling, and when Ida touched its side, she felt warmth. Not the residual warmth of a building in sunlight, but the deliberate warmth of a stove that had been fed and maintained, its firebox clean, its damper oiled, its ash pan emptied. The wide plank floor had been swept. The windows, despite their cracked exterior panes, had been fitted with interior storm panels that kept the dust and weather out while preserving the appearance of decay from outside. And on the chalkboard that ran the length of the far wall, still visible in Lloyd's precise schoolteacher's handwriting, was his last lesson, a vocabulary list dated May 14th, 1971, the words written in white chalk that had somehow survived 53 years without fading, because Lloyd had sealed the chalk with a fixative, the way an artist seals a drawing, because Lloyd believed that everything written for children deserved to last. Ida set her suitcase down beside the nearest student desk and pressed both hands against the desk's wooden lid and felt the smooth wear of the wood beneath her palms and understood that Lloyd had been coming here for decades, oiling hinges, feeding the stove, sweeping the floor, maintaining this room in secret the way he had maintained his devotion to her in every other aspect of their life. Quietly, faithfully, without expecting acknowledgement or reward. The teacher's desk sat at the front of the room, facing the rows of student desks, positioned exactly where it had stood since the schoolhouse was built. It was a large oak desk with turned legs and a wide surface covered in a sheet of tooled leather that had darkened with age to the color of strong coffee. The leather was attached to the desk surface with brass tacks arranged in a decorative border, and the desk had 2 drawers on the right side with brass pulls that Lloyd had kept polished. Ida approached the desk the way she approached every piece of work, methodically, attentively, reading its construction the way she read a garment's seams. She opened the right side drawers first. The top drawer contained a neat stack of composition notebooks, Lloyd's teaching journals, one for each year from 1958 to 1971, their marbled covers faded but intact. The bottom drawer held pencils, chalk, a wooden ruler, and a small globe with the countries colored in pastels that no longer matched any current map. These were the expected contents of a teacher's desk, but the brass key in her hand wasn't for these drawers. The brass key was too small for standard desk hardware. She ran her fingers along the leather top of the desk, and that was when her hands, those precise, patient hands that had spent 40 years reading the construction of garments by touch alone, found something wrong. The stitching along the left edge of the leather was different from the rest. 40 years of examining seams had taught Ida to distinguish between a factory stitch and a hand stitch, between thread that had aged naturally and thread that had been added later, between original construction and alteration. The leather top of the desk had been re-stitched along the left side with a thread that was slightly newer and a stitch pattern that was tighter and more deliberate than the original 19th century work. Someone had opened this leather panel and resealed it. Someone who understood that the way to hide a seam is to make it look exactly like every other seam around it, so that only someone who knew how to truly examine stitching would notice the difference. Lloyd had learned that from watching her work for 50 years. Ida pulled her reading glasses down from their perch on her head and leaned close to the desk surface, examining the altered seam the way she would examine a client's garment brought in for repair, tracing the thread path with her fingertip, testing the tension, noting where the stitch depth changed by a fraction of a millimeter. The restitching created a flap approximately 18 inches long and 12 inches wide. She worked her fingernail under the edge, the same motion she had used 10,000 times to open a seam, and lifted the leather to reveal a recessed compartment that had been carved into the oak surface of the desk, lined with cedar to prevent moisture damage, and fitted with a small brass lock that matched the key from Lloyd's pocket watch exactly. She held the key over the lock. Her hands were steady, the hands of a woman who had threaded needles in poor light for 4 decades, the hands that didn't tremble because trembling hands make crooked seams. But she did not insert the key, not yet. She knelt beside the desk and placed both palms flat on the oak surface, the way she used to lay her hands flat on a bolt of fabric before making the first cut, feeling the grain, assessing the weight, understanding the material before committing the blade. The cedar lining smelled of the same wood shavings Lloyd had used in the storage boxes where he kept his historical documents. The carving was precise, not the work of a carpenter, but the work of a patient man with good tools and unlimited time. A man who had spent 30 years as a county historian, learning that the things that matter most are the things that are preserved with the greatest care. She could see the marks of his chisel in the grain, each stroke deliberate, each cut measured, the hidden craftsmanship of a man who built this compartment the way she built a garment, from the inside out, where the true quality lives. Ida, Rosemary's voice came from the doorway. What did you find? He built a hidden compartment in the desk, Ida said. Under the leather top, he restitched the leather to hide it. I can see his handiwork. He learned my stitching technique, Rosemary. He watched me sew for 50 years, and he used what he learned to hide this. That sounds exactly like Lloyd. What's inside? I haven't opened it yet. There's a lock. The key from his watch fits. Rosemary walked to the desk and stood beside Ida and looked down at the recessed compartment with the expression of a woman who has driven 10,000 miles of Kansas back roads and thought she had seen everything the prairie had to offer and was now discovering she was wrong. Open it, she said quietly. Whatever he put in there, he put it there for you. Ida inserted the brass key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism responded with a soft, oiled click, the sound of a well-maintained thing doing what it was made to do. The lock released, and inside the cedar-lined compartment, fitting precisely within its dimensions, as though the compartment had been built around it, was a tin box. It was the kind of tin that once held biscuits or tobacco, roughly 10 inches long, 8 inches wide, and 4 inches deep, with a hinged lid and a patina of age that suggested it had been sealed for years. The lid bore no markings except for a small paper label in Lloyd's handwriting that read simply, "For Ida, when the time is right." She lifted the tin from the compartment. It was heavier than she expected. Not the weight of tin alone, but the weight of contents packed tightly. The density of paper and objects compressed into a small space with the efficiency of a man who understood that preservation requires economy. She set it on the desk surface and ran her fingers along the seam of the lid, feeling the tightness of the closure, the faint ridge of wax that Lloyd had used to seal the edges against moisture. The seal was intact. Nobody had opened this tin since Lloyd had closed it. She worked her thumbnail along the wax seal, the same careful pressure she used to open a basted seam, and the lid released with a soft exhale of air that carried the smell of old paper and cedar shavings and something else, something faint and sweet that she recognized after a moment as the particular smell of watercolor paint that has dried on paper and been stored in darkness for a very long time. The tin contained 3 things, layered with tissue paper between each one. The first layer was a set of documents. She lifted them out carefully and unfolded them on the desk surface, and Rosemary leaned in beside her, and the amber morning light through the schoolhouse windows fell across the pages like a hand laid gently on the words. They were original land grant documents, dated 1873, issued by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad under the federal land grant program that had opened the Kansas prairies to settlement. The calligraphy was elaborate, the formal copperplate of a 19th century land office, and the language was dense with the surveyor's notation of sections, townships, and ranges. But beneath the surface description, in a clause that Lloyd had highlighted with a careful pencil mark in the margin, was a provision that changed everything. The original grant reserved all subsurface mineral rights to the schoolhouse parcel, with those rights extending across 500 contiguous acres as defined by the railroad survey. Acres that included, as Lloyd's marginal notes carefully explained, the most productive wheat fields now farmed by Curtis Culver. A second document, in Lloyd's handwriting, explained what this meant. Kansas had been quietly issuing mineral exploration leases in the Flint Hills region for rare earth elements, the critical minerals used in electronics, wind turbines, and electric vehicle batteries. Geological surveys had identified significant rare earth deposits in the limestone substrata beneath the Flint Hills tallgrass prairie, and the state had begun approaching landowners about exploration rights. But the rights beneath Curtis's wheat fields did not belong to Curtis. They belonged to whoever held the deed to the Prairie Creek Schoolhouse parcel, because the 1873 land grant had separated the surface rights from the subsurface rights, and the subsurface rights had never been transferred, had never been recorded in the modern county database, and had been quietly maintained in the schoolhouse deed for 150 years, waiting for someone to read the fine print. The mineral rights belonged to Ida. Rosemary, Ida said, her voice steady despite the fact that her heart was beating against the silver thimble on its chain with a rhythm she could feel in her throat. I need you to look at this and tell me if I'm reading it correctly. Rosemary took the documents in her broad, capable hands that had gripped a steering wheel through 30 Kansas winters, and read them slowly, her bright hazel eyes moving across Lloyd's annotations with the careful attention of a woman who had spent her life making sure every child on her bus route arrived safely at their destination. Ida, she said, I'm a retired bus driver, not a lawyer, but these documents say what I think they say. You're sitting on mineral rights that cover half the county's best wheat ground, including every acre Curtis just inherited. That's what I thought too, but I need someone who can confirm the boundaries, someone who knows the survey lines. Dale Yancey, Rosemary said immediately. He surveyed every section line in this county for 30 years, and he was Lloyd's friend. They used to go fishing together on the Cottonwood River. If anyone can read these boundaries, it's Dale. But before Ida could respond, something else in the tin caught her attention. Beneath the land grant documents, separated by a layer of acid-free tissue paper that Lloyd had placed with the care of an archivist, was the second discovery. And this one made her sit down in Lloyd's teaching chair and press her hand against her mouth. They were paintings, dozens of them, small watercolors and crayon drawings and pencil sketches on composition paper and construction paper, and the backs of mimeographed worksheets. The artwork of children, preserved in chronological order from 1958 to 1971, each one labeled in Lloyd's handwriting with the student's name and the date. He had saved every piece of art his students had ever made in his classroom. Every finger painting, every crayon landscape, every watercolor sunflower and pencil horse and construction paper collage. 50 years of children's creativity, preserved with the same meticulous care a museum curator would give to a collection of Renaissance drawings. And there, in a separate bundle wrapped in its own layer of tissue paper and tied with a piece of cotton string, was a collection of 23 watercolor paintings and pencil drawings labeled in Lloyd's hand. Etta Mae Harkins, grade 3 to 6, 1968 to 1971. Rosemary saw the name and her hand went to her mouth. Oh, Ida! Oh, my lord, Etta Mae Harkins. The girl you mentioned, the one you picked up on the bus route. Ida, Etta Mae Harkins, is one of the most celebrated folk artists in America. She's in the Smithsonian. She's in the National Gallery. Her paintings sell at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars. She grew up on a cattle ranch 10 miles from this schoolhouse, and she's always said in interviews that her art teacher was the first person who ever told her she had talent. That teacher was Lloyd. These are her childhood paintings, Ida. These are the earliest works by one of the most important folk artists in the country, and Lloyd saved every single one. Ida lifted one of the paintings from the bundle. It was a watercolor on construction paper, a landscape of the Flint Hills in autumn, painted by a child's hand but with a sense of color and composition that was unmistakably the early expression of a singular talent. The brushstrokes were bold and confident, the palette vivid, burnt orange and deep gold, and the purple-gray of a Kansas thunderhead rolling across a sky that a 9-year-old girl had somehow captured with more honesty than most trained artists could achieve in a lifetime. The paint had faded slightly with age, but the power of the image remained, luminous against the dusty backdrop of the schoolroom, as alive as the day it had been painted. Lloyd knew, Ida said. He knew what these were worth, not the money. He knew what they were worth as proof. Proof that what he did in this classroom mattered. That every child he taught carried something out of this building that had value beyond what anyone could measure in bushels per acre. Then she found the third item in the tin, a folded letter written in Lloyd's hand on a single sheet of cream stationery. She unfolded it and read it aloud, her voice carrying through the schoolhouse the way Lloyd's voice had carried through this same room for 13 years of teaching. Ida, I couldn't leave you the farm. Curtis is Gerald's boy, and I promised Gerald I'd look after him. But I could leave you the truth. The mineral rights are real and they are yours. The artwork is real, and it is yours. This schoolhouse is not a condemned building. It is a library of proof that every child's work has value, and that the people who preserve that work are doing something that matters more than any wheat harvest ever could. I spent 50 years hiding these things in plain sight, the same way you spent 50 years making invisible seams that held everything together. You always made the world more beautiful than it was when you found it, Ida. Now it's your turn to be seen. All my love, Lloyd. Ida folded the letter and pressed it against the silver thimble at her chest, and sat in the silence of the schoolhouse, while the October wind pushed against the clapboard walls, and the pot-belly stove ticked with warmth, and the chalk dust on the blackboard caught the amber light like tiny stars suspended in the air of a room that had been waiting 53 years for this exact moment. Dale Yancey arrived at the schoolhouse the following afternoon, his rolled survey maps under one arm and his faded ball cap pushed back on his thinning brown hair. He was 62, tall and rangy, with a weathered face carved by 30 years of walking section lines in all weather, and when he spread the 1873 land grant documents beside his modern survey maps on the teacher's desk and began tracing the boundary descriptions with a pencil, his expression shifted from professional interest to something approaching awe. "Lloyd called me about this 3 years ago," Dale said, his quiet voice carrying the authority of a man who had measured every property line in the county. "He asked me to pull the original railroad survey plats from the state archives. I did, and what he found, what these documents confirm, is that the subsurface mineral rights attached to this schoolhouse parcel extend across 500 acres in a contiguous block that follows the original railroad survey grid. That block includes sections 12 and 13 of Township 21 South, Range 8 East. In plain language, Dale," Rosemary said from the student desk, where she was sitting with her arms crossed. "In plain language, Rosemary, the mineral rights under Curtis Culver's best wheat fields, the 240 acres he just inherited, belong to whoever holds the deed to this schoolhouse. The surface rights and the subsurface rights were separated in 1873, and they were never reunited. Curtis owns the wheat. Ida owns what's underneath it." "And what exactly is underneath it?" Ida asked. "The Kansas Geological Survey completed a preliminary assessment of the Flint Hills rare earth deposits last year. The limestone substrata in this area contain significant concentrations of cerium, neodymium, and lanthanum, rare earth elements that are critical for electronics manufacturing, wind turbine magnets, and electric vehicle battery components. The state has been approaching mineral rights holders about exploration leases. The leasing fees alone, before any extraction begins, are running between $50 and $100 per acre per year. For 500 acres, that's $25,000 to $50,000 annually, just for exploration rights. If extraction proceeds, the royalties would be substantially more." "And Curtis doesn't know any of this?" Rosemary asked. "Curtis inherited the surface rights. The surface rights are what let him grow wheat and run cattle and lease the land for farming operations. But the subsurface rights, the mineral rights, the exploration rights, the extraction royalties, those belong to the schoolhouse deed holder. That's how railroad land grants worked in Kansas. The railroads kept the mineral rights separate because they didn't know what might be underground, and they wanted the option to profit from it later. Over the decades, most of those separated mineral rights got consolidated back with the surface rights through sales and transfers, but not this parcel. This parcel's mineral rights stayed with the schoolhouse deed, and nobody noticed because nobody thought a condemned schoolhouse was worth investigating." "Nobody except Lloyd," Ida said. "Nobody except Lloyd," Dale confirmed. "He spent years in the county archives researching this. He was the county historian, Ida. He had access to records that most people don't even know exist, and he was patient. He traced the chain of title back to 1873 and confirmed that the mineral rights had never been transferred. Then he preserved the original documents in a place where only you would find them, because he knew that Curtis would inherit the farm, and that Curtis would never think to look beneath the surface of anything." Dale paused and looked at the chalkboard, where Lloyd's last vocabulary lesson still stood in preserved chalk. He told me once, this was at the Cottonwood River, we were fishing, and he was in one of his reflective moods. He said, "Dale, the problem with people like Curtis is that they think the wheat is the wealth, but the wheat is just what grows on top. The real wealth is always underneath, in the ground, in the roots, in the things nobody sees, because they're too busy counting what's visible." I thought he was being philosophical. He was being literal. Ida contacted Gideon Marsh 3 days later. Gideon was a folk art dealer from Kansas City who had spent 30 years building a reputation as one of the most respected authenticators of American vernacular and outsider art in the Midwest. Rosemary had found his name through the Kansas Arts Commission, and when Ida described the collection, 23 childhood works by Etta Mae Harkins, preserved by her school teacher since the late 1960s, Gideon Marsh drove from Kansas City to the Flint Hills the next morning without finishing his coffee. He arrived at the schoolhouse in a gray sedan that looked out of place on the county road, his leather messenger bag over one shoulder, his tortoiseshell glasses pushed up on his forehead, and when Ida led him to the teacher's desk, where the Harkins paintings were laid out on tissue paper, Gideon Marsh stood still for a full 30 seconds without speaking. Ida counted. She had become accustomed to counting silences. "Mrs. Culver," he said finally, his voice low and careful. "May I examine these?" "Of course." He pulled on cotton gloves from his messenger bag and lifted the first painting, the autumn landscape with the bold brush strokes and the vivid palette, and held it at arm's length, then brought it close, then angled it to the light from the schoolhouse window. "This is extraordinary," he said. "The color relationships, the way the orange interacts with the gray, the way the horizon line tilts to create movement. These are the same compositional instincts that define Harkins's mature work. You can see the artist she would become in every brushstroke. Lloyd always said she was the most talented student he ever taught," Ida said. "He said she saw the prairie differently from every other child in the room. The other children drew what they looked at. Etta Mae drew what the prairie felt like." Gideon examined every piece in the collection, 23 works spanning 4 years, each dated and labeled in Lloyd's careful handwriting, each preserved in acid-free tissue with archival care. When he finished, he removed his gloves and sat down in one of the student desks and looked at Ida with an expression that combined professional excitement with something that looked like gratitude. "Mrs. Culver, I need to be transparent with you. Etta Mae Harkins is represented by 3 major galleries. Her mature works have sold at auction for as high as $480,000 for a single painting. But her childhood work has never appeared on the market because it was believed to be lost. Harkins herself has said in interviews that she has no surviving artwork from before the age of 18. Lloyd would never have thrown away a child's artwork," Ida said. "He believed every piece had value." And he was right. Mrs. Culver, this collection is not just valuable as art. It is valuable as art history. These 23 works represent the only known examples of Etta Mae Harkins's formative period, the childhood years that shaped one of America's most important folk artists. They fill a gap in her documented oeuvre that scholars have been trying to fill for 2 decades, based on comparable sales of early works by major folk artists, and accounting for the historical significance and the completeness of this collection. I would appraise the Etta Mae Harkins childhood collection at $2.3 million. The schoolhouse was silent, except for the wind against the clapboard walls, and the tick of the potbelly stove, and the sound of Ida's breath, which she released in a long, slow exhalation that carried 50 years of invisible seams and quiet devotion and the particular relief of a woman who has just learned that the man she loved spent his entire life proving that she was never the one who was left with nothing. $2.3 million, Rosemary said from the student desk behind them, and her voice cracked on the number the way a voice cracks on the high note of a hymn. For children's paintings that Lloyd saved in a tin box under a teacher's desk. For children's paintings that a teacher preserved because he believed they had value, Gideon corrected gently. That's the story, Mrs. Culver. That's always the story with folk art. The people who save it are the people who see value where everyone else sees scraps. What Ida didn't know yet was that while she sat in the schoolhouse examining land grants and childhood paintings, Curtis Culver had been making a move of his own. The letter arrived the following Monday, delivered to the schoolhouse by a county sheriff's deputy who looked uncomfortable performing the errand. It was a formal notice from Curtis's attorney demanding that Ida vacate the schoolhouse property within 30 days. Curtis had filed a nuisance complaint with the County Development Authority, claiming that the condemned schoolhouse posed a structural hazard and a liability risk to adjacent agricultural operations, namely his wheat fields. The complaint requested an emergency demolition order that would authorize the county to tear down the building and return the 3 acres to unimproved prairie, effectively eliminating Ida's claim to the property and everything connected to it. Ida read the letter standing at the teacher's desk, the same desk where Lloyd had stood for 13 years teaching children to read and write and think, and the anger she felt was not the kind that burns hot and fast. It was the kind that stitches tight and holds, the anger of a seamstress who has been told her work doesn't matter by someone who has never threaded a needle. She called Dale Yancey. She called Gideon Marsh. She called Rosemary. And she called a property attorney in Topeka named Grace Leland, whom Harold Prewitt had recommended with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what kind of fight was coming. The meeting was held in the Chase County Courthouse on a Thursday morning in late November, 3 weeks after the nuisance complaint was filed. The courtroom was small, limestone walls, wooden pews, a judge's bench of dark walnut that had been dispensing Kansas justice since 1873, the same year the railroad land grants were issued. The windows looked out over the Flint Hills, and the morning light came in gold and sharp and laid itself across the proceedings like a verdict already rendered. Ida arrived first, wearing her lavender wool cardigan and her white blouse with the lace collar, her brown leather suitcase beside her chair, the silver thimble warm against her chest. Grace Leland sat beside her with a file of documents 3 inches thick. Curtis arrived with Jolene and their attorney, a corporate agricultural lawyer from Wichita named Bryce Hollowell, who charged $400 an hour and wore suits that cost more than Ida's alterations shop had earned in a good month. Curtis was wearing a new tan jacket and his polished cowboy boots, and he walked into the courtroom with the particular stride of a man who believes he is about to win because he has always won before, because the math has always been on his side, because wheat yields and lease rates and equipment depreciation schedules do not lie. Your Honor, Bryce Hollowell began, the structure in question is a condemned building that poses an imminent danger to— Mr. Hollowell, Grace Leland said, before you proceed with the nuisance complaint, I need to enter several items into the record that may affect your client's position. She opened her file. Item 1. The Prairie Creek Schoolhouse has been continuously maintained for the past 20 years by the late Lloyd Culver, as attested by contractor Dale Yancey, who assisted with structural reinforcement, stove maintenance, and weatherproofing. The building is not condemned, in fact. It is condemned only on an outdated county assessment that was never updated because no one requested a reinspection. I have here a current structural assessment from a licensed Kansas engineer confirming the building is sound. Curtis shifted in his seat. Jolene's silver pen stopped moving. Item 2. The deed to the Prairie Creek Schoolhouse includes subsurface mineral rights extending across 500 contiguous acres as defined by the original 1873 railroad land grant. These mineral rights have been verified by retired county surveyor Dale Yancey, confirmed by the Kansas Geological Survey, and authenticated by the Chase County Register of Deeds. The 500 acres in question include all 240 acres currently owned by Curtis Culver. Curtis's attorney leaned toward Curtis and whispered something. Curtis's sunburned face went the particular shade of gray that Ida associated with a seam that has just ripped under pressure. The moment when the thread gives way and the fabric separates and everything that was held together by tension suddenly falls apart. Item 3. The Schoolhouse contains a collection of 23 childhood artworks by Etta Mae Harkins, authenticated and appraised by Gideon Marsh, a recognized authority on American folk art, at a value of $2.3 million. These works are the property of Ida Culver, as contents of the Schoolhouse building. A demolition order would endanger irreplaceable cultural artifacts of national significance. "This is absurd," Curtis said, his voice rising in the small courtroom. "Those are children's drawings. They're not worth—" "Mr. Culver," the judge said, "your attorney will speak for you." But Bryce Hallowell was reading the mineral rights documents with the focused intensity of a man watching his billable hours evaporate. He looked at Curtis, then at Jolene, then at the documents, and then he asked for a 30-minute recess, which told Ida everything she needed to know about the strength of Curtis's position. During the recess, Ida could hear Curtis's voice through the closed door of the conference room. Not the words, but the tone, the rising anger of a man who has just learned that the surface he has been standing on does not belong to him in the ways that matter most. When they returned, Bryce Hallowell's face carried the expression of a lawyer who has just told his client something the client does not want to hear. "Your Honor," Hallowell said, "we respectfully withdraw the nuisance complaint." "And the demolition request?" "Withdrawn." "And the demand that Mrs. Culver vacate the property?" "Withdrawn." Curtis sat in his chair with his jaw clamped shut and his hands flat on the table and stared at a point on the limestone wall above the judge's bench, and Ida recognized the expression because she had seen it once before, on the face of a customer who had brought in a suit for alterations and been told that the fabric was so cheaply made that no amount of stitching could save it. The expression of a man confronting the limits of what money can hold together. The aftermath unfolded with the slow, methodical precision of a seam being opened stitch by stitch. Curtis had been negotiating a corporate lease agreement with a national agricultural operation that would have consolidated his 240 acres with adjacent farms into a single large-scale wheat production unit. The lease deal was worth $300,000 a year. But the corporate operations due diligence team discovered the subsurface mineral rights issue within a week of the courthouse hearing, and they pulled out immediately because no corporation would invest in farmland where the mineral rights belonged to someone else, someone who could authorize drilling, exploration, or extraction at any time without the surface owner's consent. Curtis's investors followed. The equipment financing he had arranged against the farm's projected lease income was called into question. The bank that held the mortgage on the farmhouse requested a title review. The title review revealed the mineral rights separation, which triggered a disclosure obligation that Curtis's attorney should have caught before the will was even read. Bryce Hallowell sent Curtis a letter explaining that his firm could not continue representation due to a potential conflict of interest, which was a polite way of saying that the case was unwinnable and Hollowell did not intend to lose on the public record. Within 3 months, Curtis's corporate lease had collapsed, his investors had withdrawn, his financing was under review, and his legal fees had consumed most of the $112,000 he had inherited from Lloyd's savings. He stood in the Chase County Clerk's office on a February morning, requesting copies of the original mineral rights documents that his own uncle had preserved for decades, and the clerk, a woman named Elaine, who had known Lloyd for 30 years, handed him the copies without comment, because the documents spoke for themselves, and the silence that followed was louder than anything Curtis had ever heard in his life. Jolene filed for divorce in March. The leather planner, Ida imagined, had a column for that too. Ida moved her alterations equipment into the schoolhouse in December and set up a small workstation beside the teacher's desk, her Singer sewing machine on a table near the window where the light was best, her fabric shears and pincushions arranged with the same precision Lloyd had applied to his chalk and pencils, her thimble on its chain warm against her chest as she worked. The potbelly stove kept the room warm through the Kansas winter, and on quiet mornings she could hear the wind across the prairie grass and the creak of the old student desks settling in the cold and the distant hum of the highway where Rosemary's bus route had once run, carrying children to a schoolhouse that everyone believed had stopped teaching a long time ago. She used a portion of the mineral rights income. The exploration lease alone brought $42,000 in the first year to restore the schoolhouse properly. New clapboard siding, painted white, new glass in the windows, the roof repaired, the bell tower straightened, the limestone front step replaced. The faded Prairie Creek school sign was restored and rehung level above the door. She kept the interior exactly as Lloyd had maintained it, the student desks in their rows, the potbelly stove in the center, the chalkboard with Lloyd's last lesson preserved under glass. But she added something Lloyd could not have predicted. She opened the Prairie Creek Folk Art Center and Children's Art School in April, with the Etta Mae Harkins childhood collection on permanent display in a climate-controlled glass case that Gideon Marsh helped her design. Etta Mae herself drove down from her studio in Lawrence for the opening and stood in the schoolhouse where she had painted her first sunflower at the age of 9 and wept into her hands while 40 people, neighbors, farmers, the children of children Lloyd had once taught, stood in the tall grass outside and watched through the open windows. "He was the first person who ever told me I could do something that mattered," Etta Mae said, standing before the chalkboard where Lloyd's vocabulary lessons still stood in preserved chalk. "He told me that my pictures were important. He told me that the way I saw the world was a gift. I was 9 years old, and I believed him. And that belief carried me through every year of my life after that. He saved my paintings because he believed they had value. And he was right, not because they're worth money, because they're proof that what happens inside a schoolroom changes everything that happens outside of it." Ida established 3 scholarships for rural Kansas students pursuing art education, funded by the mineral rights income. She named them the Lloyd Culver Scholarships because Lloyd had always believed that every child's work had value, and now there was money to prove it, money that came from underneath the very ground Curtis had dismissed as the only thing that mattered. The first 3 recipients were a girl from Bazaar who painted watercolors of cattle, a boy from Matfield Green who carved animals from cottonwood, and a teenager from Cassaday who made quilts with designs so intricate that Ida, who had spent 40 years examining stitching, could not find a single flaw. The schoolhouse became a gathering place. Thursday morning, coffee with Rosemary moved from Ida's kitchen to the schoolhouse, and then other women began joining. Neighbors who had known Lloyd, retired teachers, former students who drove in from Wichita and Topeka and Kansas City to see the building where they had learned to read and write, and where their childhood artwork now hung on the walls beside paintings worth more than most of them would earn in a decade. Children from the surrounding ranches and farms came after school to paint and draw at the old student desks, and Ida watched them from the teacher's desk, with Lloyd's pocket watch on the surface beside her, its brass key returned to its hidden compartment, its ticking the only sound in the room, besides the scratch of crayons on paper, and the wind against the walls, and the quiet breathing of a building that had come back to life. If you stayed with us through this entire journey, from a devastating dismissal at a Kansas attorney's office to a condemned schoolhouse that held land grants and lost masterpieces, and the meticulous love of a man who spent 50 years hiding treasures in a teacher's desk, then you already understand what kind of person this story was made for. If Ida's story touched something deep inside you, if you've ever been underestimated because of your age, if you've been handed 3 acres and a shack with a chalkboard and told to be grateful, if you've discovered that what looked like a devastating ending was actually the first stitch in something more beautiful than you had ever dared to imagine, then you understand why these stories matter. Leave just one word in the comments describing the exact moment when you realized you were worth so much more than anyone around you ever knew. One word. That is the only stitch it takes to hold the seam, because Ida's story proves that love hides its greatest treasures in the places no one thinks to look. That patience is not passivity. It is craftsmanship, practiced by those who understand that the strongest seams are the ones nobody sees until they bear the weight, that you are never too old to open a tin box in a teacher's desk and discover that the person who loved you most spent decades making certain you would never be powerless, and that the people who truly love us do not just say it. They stitch hidden compartments and preserve children's paintings and file land grants in secret and wait with the absolute faith of a teacher who knows the right student will come along and read the lesson exactly as it was written. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that their worth isn't defined by who dismissed them, but by who loved them enough to spend a lifetime hiding the proof inside a teacher's desk and waiting. Somewhere tonight, a quiet woman in a quiet town is holding a key. Everyone has told her opens nothing, wondering if anyone will ever see the work of her hands. Your word, your share, your small act of recognition might be the stitch that holds her whole life together. Welcome to the last chapter. We'll see you in the next story.